Picture this. It's 4:17 in the afternoon on a quiet Tuesday in Broken Arrow, Oklahoma. The sun is streaming through the windows of a modest two-story house on Cedar Lane. Inside, 23-year-old Marcus Thompson is taking a nap after working the night shift at the local factory. Suddenly, the sound of shattering glass pierces the silence. Three figures dressed in black, their faces covered by bandanas, burst through his back door. What happens in the next 90 seconds will leave three teenagers dead on his kitchen floor and Marcus in handcuffs, facing a murder trial that would divide an entire community. But here's what nobody expected. By the time the dust settled, the real shocking truth wasn't who fired the shots. It was who the jury believed deserved to walk free. Marcus grabbed his AR-15 rifle, and in less than 2 minutes, 3 lives were over. The question that haunted everyone wasn't whether he pulled the trigger. Security cameras caught it all. The question was simple yet devastating. Was Marcus Thompson a cold-blooded killer or a man who had every right to defend his home? And when the jury delivered their verdict, the courtroom erupted in chaos, because what they decided changed everything we thought we knew about justice in America.
Dark Stories. True crime is your home for chilling crimes, unsolved mysteries, and the darkest secrets the world has to offer. We uncover shocking cases, disturbing truths, and mysterious disappearances. Hit subscribe and join us.
Broken Arrow, Oklahoma isn't the kind of place where you expect to see headlines about deadly shootings. With tree-lined streets, well-maintained lawns, and the kind of neighbors who still wave when they pass each other, it's the epitome of small-town America. The Thompson house on Cedar Lane was no different. A simple ranch-style home with a white picket fence and a vegetable garden that Marcus's grandmother had planted decades earlier. Marcus had inherited the house after she passed away 6 months prior, and he was still adjusting to living alone for the first time in his life. Marcus Thompson wasn't your typical gun owner. He worked double shifts at the Tulsa steel plant, coached Little League baseball on weekends, and had never been in trouble with the law. His neighbors described him as quiet, respectful, and someone who would give you the shirt off his back if you needed it. The AR-15 rifle that would soon make national headlines had been his grandfather's hunting rifle, modified legally for home protection after a string of break-ins had plagued their neighborhood the previous summer. The 3 teenagers who would change his life forever were Dylan Mitchell, 17 years old and a high school dropout, Kevin Rodriguez, 16, who had been in and out of juvenile detention for petty theft, and Austin Clark, also 17, whose mother worked 2 jobs to keep their family afloat. Austin had been Marcus's little brother's friend in elementary school, a detail that would make the events of that afternoon even more heartbreaking. These weren't hardened criminals or career burglars. They were kids who had made what they thought would be an easy score, targeting a house they believed was empty during the day. This wasn't just going to be about a robbery gone wrong. This case would force America to confront the very foundation of our self-defense laws, the boundaries of the Castle Doctrine, and the question that keeps homeowners awake at night. How far is too far when someone breaks into your home? But investigators would soon learn that the line between victim and perpetrator wasn't as clear as anyone initially believed, and the truth about what happened in that kitchen would leave everyone questioning everything they thought they knew about justice. The story actually begins 24 hours earlier, on Monday night, when Austin Clark was scrolling through Instagram and saw a photo that Dylan had posted from Marcus's backyard. Dylan had been dating Sarah, a girl who used to babysit for Marcus's neighbors, and she had mentioned in passing that Marcus worked night shifts and slept during the day. What started as innocent teenage gossip would soon turn into a plan that none of them fully understood the consequences of. The 3 boys spent Monday evening walking through the neighborhood, noting which houses appeared empty, which had security systems, and which had the easiest access points. Text messages recovered from Austin's phone would later show the planning that went into their decision. At 11:47 p.m. on Monday, Austin texted Dylan, "Dude works nights, house is empty all day Tuesday, easy money." Dylan responded at 12:15 a.m. "You sure nobody's home?" Austin replied, "Positive. Sarah said he's always gone during the day, plus his car wasn't in the driveway when we walked by." What they didn't know was that Marcus had called in sick that Tuesday morning. For the first time in 3 months, he would be home during the day, catching up on the sleep he had been losing due to stress about his grandmother's medical bills that were still piling up. The boys had been watching Marcus's house since early morning, hidden behind the abandoned Johnson property next door. They saw his car leave at 7 a.m. What they didn't realize was that Marcus had only gone to the grocery store and returned while they were getting breakfast at the corner deli. By 4 p.m., they were convinced the house was empty. Dylan later told investigators that they had spent hours psyching themselves up, passing around a bottle of cheap whiskey that Kevin had stolen from his stepfather's liquor cabinet. None of them had ever committed a burglary before. None of them owned a gun. They carried brass knuckles and a crowbar, tools they thought would be sufficient to break in and grab whatever cash or electronics they could find. Marcus, meanwhile, had finally fallen asleep around 2 p.m. after tossing and turning all morning. The stress of losing his grandmother, combined with mounting debt and the pressure of working overtime to pay for her funeral, had left him exhausted and emotionally drained. He had placed his AR-15 rifle in the bedroom closet 6 months earlier, after the neighborhood break-ins had started, but had never imagined he would need to use it. His phone was on silent, his curtains were drawn, and for the first time in weeks, he was getting the deep sleep his body desperately needed. What were the kids really thinking as they approached the back door? Austin would later tell investigators that his hands were shaking so badly he could barely hold the crowbar. Dylan kept looking over his shoulder, convinced that every car that drove by was a police officer. Kevin, the youngest of the three, had thrown up twice behind the Johnson house before they made their move. These weren't seasoned criminals. They were scared kids who had convinced themselves that this would be quick and easy. But the first sound of breaking glass would set off a chain reaction that none of them could take back. Marcus had just seconds to process what was happening. The sound of shattering glass jolted him awake, his heart immediately pounding as his mind tried to determine if he was dreaming or if someone was actually inside his house. The heavy footsteps on his kitchen floor, the hushed voices, the sound of cabinet doors being opened. This was real. His grandfather's rifle was in the closet, loaded, with the safety off. Everything his grandfather had taught him about gun safety flashed through his mind. Never point it at anything you don't intend to destroy. Keep your finger off the trigger until you're ready to shoot. Be certain of your target and what's behind it. But as he heard the intruders moving toward his bedroom, all of that training compressed into a single terrifying realization. Hesitate, and he might not survive the next 5 minutes. The moment Marcus stepped out of his bedroom with the AR-15, everything changed. Security footage from his neighbor's camera would later show the exact timeline. At 4:17:23 p.m., the back door was breached. At 4:18:45 p.m., the first gunshot was fired. By 4:19:52 p.m., all 3 teenagers were on the ground, and Marcus was calling 911 with hands that were shaking so violently he could barely hold the phone. But what happened during those crucial 87 seconds? According to Marcus's testimony, he heard voices coming from his kitchen and what sounded like his cabinets being opened. He grabbed his rifle and crept down the hallway, his bare feet silent on the hardwood floors. When he reached the corner where the hallway opened into the kitchen, he could see 3 figures dressed in black, their faces covered, going through his belongings. He would later tell investigators that his first instinct wasn't to shoot, it was to scare them away. He stepped into the doorway and shouted, "Get out of my house!" The sound of his voice caused all 3 intruders to spin around. What investigators found in the aftermath would paint 2 very different pictures of what happened next. Dylan Mitchell, the 17-year-old who had been going through Marcus's silverware drawer, was found with brass knuckles on his right hand. Kevin Rodriguez had been in the process of unplugging Marcus's television when the shooting started. Austin Clark was near the back door, apparently serving as a lookout. The positioning of their bodies told a story that both the prosecution and defense would interpret completely differently. Marcus's account was that Austin lunged toward him with what appeared to be a weapon. In the dim light of the kitchen, Marcus couldn't tell if it was a knife or a gun, but the movement was aggressive and fast. That's when he fired the first shot. Austin dropped immediately. Dylan, seeing his friend fall, started moving toward Marcus, and Marcus fired twice more. Kevin, who had been frozen near the television, finally moved toward the back door, and Marcus fired his final shot. 4 shots in total. 4 shots that ended 3 lives and changed his forever. But the physical evidence would complicate this narrative in ways that nobody expected. The coroner's report revealed that Austin Clark had been shot in the chest from a distance of approximately 12 feet. Dylan Mitchell had been shot twice, once in the chest and once in the back. Kevin Rodriguez, the youngest at 16, had been shot in the back as he was apparently trying to flee. These details would become the foundation of the prosecution's case. That Marcus had continued shooting even after the threat had passed. That he had shot fleeing teenagers in the back, and that his actions had crossed the line from self-defense into murder. Marcus's 911 call, played in its entirety during the trial, captured the immediate aftermath in chilling detail, his voice, barely above a whisper, shaking with shock and adrenaline. 911, what's your emergency? I just shot 3 people. They broke into my house. They're not moving. I think they're dead. Oh God, what did I do? The dispatcher tried to keep him calm while simultaneously dispatching police and medical units to the scene. Sir, are you injured? Are the intruders still a threat? Marcus's response would be played over and over in the media. No, they're not moving. There's so much blood. I was scared. I thought they were going to kill me. If you're still with us, drop a comment saying, I'm still here. Let's see who's been paying attention to every detail of this case. When police arrived at 4:23 p.m., they found Marcus sitting on his front porch, the rifle placed on the ground 10 feet away from him, his hands visible and raised. The 3 teenagers were pronounced dead at the scene. By 5:15 p.m., Marcus Thompson was in handcuffs, not because he was immediately considered a criminal, but because protocol demanded that he be taken in for questioning while investigators processed what had become a crime scene. The man who had been sleeping peacefully in his own bed 2 hours earlier was now at the center of a case that would dominate headlines for months and force an entire community to choose sides. The immediate aftermath of the shooting sent shockwaves through Broken Arrow that would reverberate for months. Within hours of the incident, news vans lined Cedar Lane, transforming the quiet suburban street into a media circus. Marcus's neighbors found themselves caught between conflicting emotions, horror at the loss of 3 young lives, and relief that someone had finally taken a stand against the break-ins that had been terrorizing their community. The Hendersons, who lived directly across from Marcus, told reporters that they had been considering moving after their house was burglarized twice in the previous year. Mrs. Patterson, an elderly widow who lived next door, said she had been sleeping with a baseball bat next to her bed for months. The parents of the 3 teenagers arrived at the scene within hours, their grief raw and overwhelming. Dylan Mitchell's mother, Rebecca, collapsed when she saw the body bag being loaded into the coroner's van. She screamed accusations at the police, at the media, and at Marcus himself. He murdered my baby. Dylan was just a child. This man executed 3 children and you're treating him like a hero. Kevin Rodriguez's father, a construction worker who had been struggling to keep his son out of trouble, stood silent in the crowd, tears streaming down his face. Austin Clark's mother, who worked as a nurse at the local hospital, had to be sedated after identifying her son's body. The initial police statements only added fuel to the growing controversy. Sheriff Mike Davidson told reporters that while the investigation was ongoing, preliminary evidence suggested that Marcus had acted within his rights under Oklahoma's Castle Doctrine, also known as the Stand Your Ground law. This statement prompted immediate backlash from the victims' families and their advocates. Civil rights attorney Patricia Williams, who would later represent the families, called the sheriff's comments premature and prejudiced, arguing that the case deserved a full investigation before any conclusions were drawn about the legality of Marcus's actions. But the evidence that investigators found inside the house would raise questions that nobody had anticipated. Hidden in Austin Clark's backpack, investigators discovered detailed photographs of Marcus's house, including pictures of the back door, the window layout, and even the interior that had been taken through windows. These weren't random photographs. They showed a level of surveillance and planning that suggested this wasn't a spontaneous break-in. Even more disturbing was a handwritten note found in Dylan Mitchell's pocket that read, "TV in living room, check kitchen for cash, old guy works nights." The level of premeditation these items suggested would significantly impact how the case was perceived by both the community and potential jurors. The toxicology reports added another layer of complexity to the case. All three teenagers had elevated blood alcohol levels, with Kevin Rodriguez's blood alcohol content measuring 0.2, well above the legal limit for adults. They also tested positive for marijuana, which Dylan's mother would later claim was prescribed for anxiety. Defense attorneys would argue that the intoxication explained why the teenagers had made such poor decisions and why they hadn't immediately fled when confronted. Prosecutors, however, would use the same evidence to argue that impaired teenagers posed less of a threat than Marcus claimed, and that a reasonable person would have recognized they were dealing with scared, intoxicated children rather than dangerous criminals. The community's response was swift and divided. A Facebook group called Justice for Dylan, Kevin, and Austin gained over 3,000 members in the first week, organizing candlelight vigils and calling for Marcus to be charged with murder. Countergroups like Defend Your Castle and Stand with Marcus emerged just as quickly, raising money for his legal defense and organizing their own rallies supporting his right to protect his home. Local businesses found themselves unwittingly drawn into the controversy as customers demanded to know which side they supported. The hardware store that sold Marcus the ammunition for his rifle received both death threats and thank you letters. The high school where two of the teenagers had been students became a battleground between grieving families and community members who felt the boys had brought their fate upon themselves. Then investigators discovered something inside the house that nobody had expected, something that would raise even more questions about what really happened that Tuesday afternoon. Hidden behind Marcus's refrigerator, investigators found a small surveillance camera that had been recording continuously for the previous week. The camera had been installed after the neighborhood break-ins, but Marcus had forgotten to mention it during his initial interviews with police. When investigators reviewed the footage, what they saw would change the entire narrative of the case and leave everyone wondering whether the truth was more complicated than anyone had imagined. 6 months after the shooting, District Attorney Jennifer Walsh made the decision that would define her career and divide the community even further. She charged Marcus Thompson with 3 counts of second-degree murder. Standing before a packed courtroom for the arraignment, Walsh argued that while Marcus had the right to defend his home, he had used excessive force against teenagers who posed no immediate threat to his life. The evidence will show that Marcus Thompson fired 4 shots at 3 scared children who were trying to flee his home, she told the packed courtroom. This wasn't self-defense, this was execution. The prosecution's case centered on the forensic evidence that painted Marcus as a man who had lost control rather than someone acting in reasonable self-defense. Prosecutor Walsh brought in expert witnesses who testified about the trajectory of the bullets, the distance from which they were fired, and the positioning of the bodies. Dr. Sarah Chen, the forensic pathologist who performed the autopsies, testified that Dylan Mitchell's second wound, the shot to his back, had been fired from a downward angle, suggesting that he was either falling or trying to crawl away when Marcus fired. Kevin Rodriguez's wound pattern indicated that he had been shot while facing the back door, apparently trying to escape. The prosecution's most powerful moment came when they played the enhanced audio from Marcus's surveillance camera. In the background of the shooting, barely audible but clear enough to be transcribed, you could hear Austin Clark's voice. "Please don't shoot us, we're just kids." This 15-second audio clip, played repeatedly during the trial, became the emotional centerpiece of the prosecution's argument. Walsh argued that Marcus had heard this plea and continued shooting anyway, crossing the line from justified self-defense into cold-blooded murder. Marcus's defense attorney, veteran criminal lawyer Robert Hayes, painted a completely different picture of the events that afternoon. Hayes argued that Marcus had awakened to find 3 masked intruders in his home, armed with weapons and operating under the cover of darkness created by the drawn curtains. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," Hayes said during his opening statement, Marcus Thompson had seconds to make a decision that would either save his life or end it. He couldn't see their ages. He couldn't see their faces. All he could see were three people who had violently broken into his home, armed with brass knuckles and crowbars, going through his belongings. The defense focused heavily on Oklahoma's Castle Doctrine, which gives homeowners broad protection when defending their property against intruders. Hayes brought in legal experts who testified that under Oklahoma law, Marcus had no duty to retreat in his own home and was legally justified in using deadly force if he reasonably believed it was necessary to prevent death or serious bodily injury. The defense also emphasized the teenager's level of preparation, showing the jury the surveillance photos and the handwritten notes that proved this was a planned burglary, not a crime of opportunity. The emotional testimony from Marcus himself would prove to be the most pivotal moment of the trial. Taking the stand in his own defense, Marcus described the terror he felt upon waking up to find strangers in his home. "I had lost my grandmother 6 months before," he testified, his voice breaking with emotion. "This house was all I had left of her. When I heard those voices, when I saw those figures going through her things, I wasn't thinking about the law or about being reasonable. I was thinking about staying alive." When Prosecutor Walsh pressed him during cross-examination about why he continued shooting after the first shot, Marcus's answer resonated throughout the courtroom. "It happened so fast. Everything was chaos. I was terrified they were going to kill me. I didn't count shots. I just reacted." But then everything changed when a neighbor came forward with information that nobody, not the prosecution, not the defense, not the investigators, had anticipated. Mrs. Eleanor Vasquez, who lived in the house behind Marcus's property, approached the defense team 3 weeks into the trial with evidence that would completely alter how everyone understood the events of that afternoon. She had been too afraid to come forward initially, she explained, but her conscience wouldn't let her stay silent any longer. What she revealed would shock the courtroom and force everyone to reconsider everything they thought they knew about guilt and innocence. Mrs. Vasquez's revelation sent shockwaves through the trial that neither side had prepared for. She testified that from her kitchen window she had witnessed the entire break-in unfold, and what she saw contradicted key elements of both the prosecution's and defense's narratives. According to her testimony, Austin Clark hadn't been trying to escape when he was shot. He had been moving toward Marcus with something in his hand that reflected the afternoon light coming through the kitchen window. She also testified that she had heard the teenagers discussing their plan while they waited behind the abandoned property, including Dylan saying, "If someone's home, we'll just have to deal with it." But Mrs. Vasquez's most explosive testimony concerned what happened immediately after the shooting. She claimed that she saw someone else, a fourth person, fleeing from the scene through the backyard. This person, she said, had been crouched behind Marcus's shed during the entire incident and had run away immediately after the shots were fired. When pressed for details, she described a young woman, approximately college age, with long dark hair. The defense immediately requested a recess to investigate this claim, while the prosecution argued that the testimony was unreliable and irrelevant to the case. The revelation of a possible fourth accomplice opened up entirely new questions about the case. If there had been a fourth person involved, why hadn't the 3 deceased teenagers mentioned her during their planning? Was she part of the burglary crew, or had she been there for a different reason? Most importantly, if Mrs. Vasquez's testimony was accurate, it meant that someone with knowledge of the crime had been walking free for nearly 8 months, while Marcus faced the possibility of life in prison. Private investigator Linda Morrison, hired by the defense team, quickly identified the mysterious fourth person as Elizabeth Rodriguez, a 21-year-old college student who had been dating Dylan Mitchell. When confronted by investigators, Elizabeth initially denied any involvement in the burglary, but phone records showed that she had been in contact with Dylan throughout the day of the break-in. Under pressure, she eventually admitted to driving the teenagers to Marcus's neighborhood and waiting in the car while they committed the burglary. Her confession revealed details about the planning that painted a much more premeditated picture of the crime. According to Elizabeth's statement, The burglary had been planned for over a week. Dylan had specifically targeted Marcus's house because Elizabeth had seen Marcus's social media posts about working night shifts and had assumed the house would be empty during the day. She had even provided the teenagers with inside information about the layout of the house, having been inside once before when she helped Dylan's ex-girlfriend Sarah babysit for the neighbors. Most damaging to the prosecution's case was Elizabeth's admission that the teenagers had discussed what to do if they encountered someone in the house, with Dylan saying that they would do whatever it takes to avoid getting arrested. The prosecution's case began to crumble as more details emerged about the level of planning involved in the burglary. Elizabeth's confession revealed that the teenagers had been surveilling Marcus's house for 3 days, had researched the neighborhood's police response times, and had even practiced breaking in using a similar door at Dylan's house. This wasn't the spontaneous, opportunistic crime that Prosecutor Walsh had described in her opening statement. This was a carefully planned invasion by individuals who had considered the possibility of confronting a homeowner and had decided to proceed anyway. Public opinion, which had already been divided, became even more polarized as Elizabeth's involvement became public knowledge. Supporters of the teenagers' families argued that the revelation didn't change the fact that 3 unarmed children had been killed and that Marcus's response had been disproportionate regardless of how much planning had gone into the burglary. Supporters of Marcus argued that the new evidence proved he had faced a genuine threat from determined criminals who were prepared to use violence if necessary. The case began to raise uncomfortable questions about the justice system itself. Had the district attorney been too quick to file murder charges without fully investigating the case? Had the initial police investigation been thorough enough? Why had it taken 8 months and a trial for Elizabeth's involvement to come to light? Critics argued that the prosecution had been more interested in making a political statement about gun violence than in seeking justice. Supporters countered that without the murder charges, important evidence about the case might never have emerged. As the trial neared its conclusion, both legal experts and community members struggled to predict how the jury would respond to the conflicting evidence and testimony they had heard. The case had evolved far beyond a simple question of self-defense versus excessive force. It had become a complex examination of fear, preparation, split-second decision-making, and the lengths to which people will go to protect what they value most. When the jury retired to deliberate, they faced not just the task of determining Marcus's guilt or innocence, but of defining the boundaries of justifiable self-defense in an age when home invasions were becoming increasingly common and homeowners increasingly armed. After 3 days of deliberation, the jury requested to review the surveillance camera footage one final time. The courtroom was packed beyond capacity as family members from both sides, community activists, legal observers, and media representatives waited for what many considered the most important self-defense verdict in Oklahoma's recent history. Judge Patricia Morrison had to call for additional security as tensions between the opposing groups reached a fever pitch outside the courthouse. Marcus Thompson sat at the defense table, his hands folded, his face pale with exhaustion from 8 months of legal proceedings that had consumed his life savings and left him unemployed. His sister Sarah held his mother's hand in the front row, both women silently praying for a verdict that would allow Marcus to begin rebuilding his shattered life. Across the aisle, the families of Dylan Mitchell, Kevin Rodriguez, and Austin Clark sat together, their grief having forged an unbreakable bond between them. Dylan's mother, Rebecca, clutched a framed photograph of her son, taken at his high school graduation just weeks before his death. At 2:47 p.m. on a cold February afternoon, the jury filed back into the courtroom. The foreman, a retired teacher named James Wilson, stood slowly as Judge Morrison asked if they had reached a verdict. "We have, Your Honor," he replied, his voice barely audible in the hushed courtroom. As he handed the sealed verdict to the bailiff, the only sound was the clicking of camera shutters and the quiet sobbing of Austin Clark's mother. Judge Morrison opened the envelope and paused for what seemed like an eternity before reading the verdict. In the case of the state of Oklahoma versus Marcus Thompson, on the charge of second-degree murder in the death of Dylan Mitchell, we the jury find the defendant. She paused, looking out over the packed courtroom. Not guilty. The reaction was immediate and explosive. Supporters of Marcus erupted in cheers while the victims' families cried out in anguish. Rebecca Mitchell screamed, "No! He murdered my son!" before collapsing into the arms of the victim's advocate beside her. But Judge Morrison wasn't finished. On the charge of second-degree murder in the death of Kevin Rodriguez, we, the jury, find the defendant not guilty. The courtroom erupted again, louder this time. On the charge of second-degree murder in the death of Austin Clark, we, the jury, find the defendant not guilty on all charges. Marcus Thompson buried his face in his hands as his defense attorney Robert Hayes embraced him. His mother's cries of relief mixed with the anguished sobs of the victims' families in a cacophony of emotion that captured the deep divisions the case had created. In the chaos that followed, Judge Morrison had to call for order repeatedly as family members and supporters from both sides shouted across the courtroom. Outside, the crowds that had gathered began chanting competing slogans. Justice for Marcus, and justice for Dylan, Kevin, and Austin. Police had to form barriers to keep the opposing groups separated as emotions reached a boiling point that threatened to spill over into violence. The aftermath of the verdict revealed the true complexity of seeking justice in cases where there are no clear heroes or villains, only human beings whose lives intersected in the most tragic way possible. Marcus Thompson walked out of the courthouse a free man, but freedom came with a price that would follow him for the rest of his life. The legal fees had consumed his life savings, forcing him to sell his grandmother's house, the very property he had been defending on that Tuesday afternoon. He moved across the state to start over, but the notoriety of the case made it impossible to escape his past. Job applications were rejected, relationships ended when potential partners Googled his name, and the simple act of meeting new people became fraught with the question of whether and when to reveal his identity. The families of Dylan Mitchell, Kevin Rodriguez, and Austin Clark were left to navigate their grief while grappling with a justice system that had declared their children's deaths legally justified. Rebecca Mitchell started a foundation advocating for stricter limitations on Castle Doctrine laws, arguing that the current statutes gave homeowners too much latitude to use deadly force against intruders. Her advocacy work became both her healing process and her way of ensuring that her son's death had meaning. Kevin Rodriguez's father left Broken Arrow entirely, unable to bear living in the community where his son had died and where half the neighbors considered that death justified. Elizabeth Rodriguez, the getaway driver whose confession had ultimately strengthened Marcus's case, was sentenced to 3 years in prison for accessory to burglary and perjury for initially lying to investigators. Her sentence sparked additional controversy, with critics arguing that she bore significant responsibility for the deaths of her 3 co-conspirators. Others contended that she was herself a victim, a young woman who had made a terrible decision but never intended for anyone to die. The case forced Oklahoma lawmakers to re-examine the state's Castle Doctrine legislation, though no changes were ultimately made to the law. Legal experts argued that the Thompson case demonstrated that the current statutes struck the right balance between protecting homeowners and preventing vigilante justice. Critics maintained that the law was too broad, giving homeowners essentially unlimited authority to use deadly force against intruders, regardless of the actual threat they posed. Perhaps most tragically, the case left a community permanently divided. Neighbors who had once shared cookouts and helped each other with yard work found themselves on opposite sides of an ideological chasm. The Cedar Lane neighborhood, once a symbol of suburban tranquility, became a battleground for competing philosophies about self-defense, gun rights, and the value of human life. Some families moved away entirely, unable to bear the constant reminders of that afternoon's violence. Marcus Thompson rarely speaks publicly about the case, but in a brief interview given 2 years after the verdict, he reflected on the impossible choice he faced that day. "People ask me if I would do anything differently," he said, his voice heavy with the weight of 3 lives lost. "The honest answer is, I don't know. In that moment, with those people in my house, I believed my life was in danger. But not a day goes by that I don't think about those boys, about their families, about all the lives that were changed forever because of 90 seconds of chaos. The question that haunted the courtroom continues to haunt our communities. In an age of increasing violence and decreasing trust, how do we balance our right to protect ourselves and our families with our responsibility to preserve human life? Marcus Thompson was legally justified in his actions, but was justice truly served? 3 teenagers made a terrible decision that cost them their lives, but did they deserve to die for breaking into a house? These questions don't have easy answers, and perhaps that's the most important lesson of all. What do you think really happened that Tuesday afternoon in Broken Arrow? Was Marcus Thompson a man defending his home, or did he cross the line into vigilante justice? If you had been in his position, awakened by the sound of breaking glass to find 3 strangers in your home, what would you have done? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. We read every single one, and cases like this remind us why these conversations are so important. And if this story affected you the way it affected an entire community, make sure you hit that like button and subscribe for more real-life cases that challenge everything we think we know about justice, self-defense, and the thin line between victim and perpetrator. Because sometimes the most important stories are the ones that don't have happy endings. They have real ones.